I finished all 6 books that I read in February, and I know I'm a bit late in talking about the last 2 books, but I wanted to do them just before I talked about the books that I planned on reading for March and what the theme for March would be. So in this video I'm going to talk about the third 2 books that I read over February, which were The Eye of the North by Sinéad and The Murderer's Ape by Jakob Wegelius. And they were both similar in some ways, but also very different, and I think my experience of reading them both were very different. And I think what I want to talk about today in relation to these 2 books was the question, I guess, of how big should a children's book be? Because obviously these are different sizes, but I think in comparison to other books within the same age range, they're on the chunkier side. So let's start with talking about The Eye of the North by Sinéad. Now this story is probably one of the more basic stories of the month that I've read in terms of the overall plot. And I think above all, this one follows the more traditional plot that we would expect from a children's book, in that this is about a girl whose parents disappear very early on, and then she is thrusted into this adventure in which she is trying to figure out where her parents are, because she knows they're not dead. They have been kidnapped. She discovers that they have been kidnapped, and that she wants to go find them, rescue them, and bring them back and figure out what's going on. So then she is cast upon this boat to the north, to Greenland, where an entire kind of final melee of events happens in which she tries to rescue her parents and discovers the reality of what is going on, why her parents were kidnapped, and the villain who is doing all the things he is doing and why. So in terms of plot, I think this is the one that you would kind of expect the most for a book of this sort of genre and age range, so because it follows that sort of fantastical element. It definitely gets more fantastical once they get to Greenland, and then you have like all of the fantasy elements. So in that respect, this kind of fits the genre, I think, the most, and doesn't try to really push the boundaries so much. However, it is big. I gave this book a 3.5. I really loved it at the start. I think the tone of the first half of the book was really interesting. And it kind of just got off its feet really quickly and was just action after action after action. And I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed following the main character, who was forced to be independent from like the word go. So she doesn't trust anybody, and from her parents kind of brought her up to not trust anyone, not even her parents, because they thought that she would be safer that way, etc, etc. But because of that, she's got a really interesting character in that she literally just only trusts herself, but even though she knows that half the time she's wrong, and she really wants to trust other people, but she can't bring herself to do it. And she, you know, has this sort of like struggle of making her first friend, and it's quite sweet watching their relationship grow and everything. And yeah, she was just a really great character. And then halfway through, and kind of more in the final third, the book really started to drag. The reason I think it really started to drag was because suddenly there were like, however many, like 4 or 5 new characters that were introduced in the denouement of the piece. They were introduced, and not only were they introduced, but they also had their own story arcs, which had been going on for years before this book happened. So then the book was trying to actually go through their story arcs and everything. And I was just like, too many characters were being added. Too many story arcs were trying to be put into a story that didn't actually need them. Because there were a few characters which were completely superfluous. They just came in at the end. And then they were like more devices as to get some of the other characters to the final destination. So kind of it felt like all these characters didn't really need a plot line, but they got a plot line, and it made the book so much more complicated and slow than it should have been, just because the author was trying to get all of these storylines out. So that was just kind of the thing that kind of brought it down for me. It really sort of deteriorated because there was too much going on. But also I think having known how good the book was helped to retain the book's kind of star rating. That's why I didn't want to give it like a proper 3. I was like 3.5 because the start was good. So then I read The Murderer's Ache by Jakob Wegelius. Now this book is probably, so far in the year, my favourite book that I've read. Which makes sense, I guess, because this was on Shazza's top 10 books of her previous year, or 2018, and Shazza and I share a lot of similar tastes in books, so she loved this. I kind of had an inkling I would, but I didn't realise how much I would love this. But it's strange because it's really hard to determine this book as a children's book, I think. It was published by Pushkin's children's press, and it has won various awards in Sweden, I think, which is where it comes from, for children's literature and stuff. So it has definitely been very much instilled as a children's book, and I guess in some respects it does make sense. I think in terms of language that is used, it's very simple. But then at the same time, is it simple just because it's told from a gorilla's perspective? And I think that is a very interesting part, because the gorilla has the capacity of human thought and human feeling, and she has learnt empathy, she's learnt kind of how to exist in a human society, but she can't speak. And I think then, because she's mute, and this story is told from her perspective that she has written, she has typed out on a typewriter, I think that definitely has affected the language that she uses, and that kind of casts her as a character in a really interesting light, I personally think. But anyway, this story follows Sally Jones, our gorilla. She is an engineer on a very small little boat with her captain, and her captain has kind of saved her a fair few times in her past. So they've grown very close to each other, they've grown very attached to each other. But then he is charged for the murder of somebody else, and then Sally Jones, the gorilla, kind of knows that it's not true. So she is cast out into her life to redeem her captain and to kind of get him out of prison. Now this book is quite chunky. It feels like there's a very much a good reason for it being chunky, because I think it spans something like 3 or 5 years. It spans a nice amount of time, and that's something that I really appreciated in this book. It was a slow read, and it wasn't that it was slow and boring. It was slow because it was subtle, and it was really depicted the mundanity of everyday life, and it did feel like you were reading somebody's life memoir. I mean, I know it's kind of made out to be a memoir, but it felt really real, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and it felt very human. Because of that, you're going through a very human experience, which isn't something that could just happen in a month. I think everything that she experiences and the plot of this story needs to be happening over X amount of years for it to make sense and for it to feel realistic and to feel human. It's not like, a fantasy book where they have to go to a temple one day and then suddenly they realise at the temple that they've got 3 days to travel across the whole country to sort of save magic, and then somehow they do. Like that, because that, you can get away with it in kind of high fantasy because you can just glaze over that. But here it just felt very real, and it wasn't. I think the only fantastical element of this book was the fact that she was a gorilla with human thought and emotions, but that felt real, and it felt very human. And I don't think there was any points where I really felt bored, even though it was slow. And I think I really enjoyed taking my time with this book, but I read it all in one day. I couldn't put it down because I just wanted to know what happened next, and I really wanted Sally Jones to be okay, and I got so invested in her story and so invested in all of the characters of this book, because there's a big cast of characters. I got invested in all of their stories, and it just felt wonderful to read and be a part of. And then when I finished reading it, I felt really sad because I had just felt like somebody's story had come to an end, and I was like, I want to stay with this person for the rest of their lives. And yeah, it was just a very, very lovely read, and I will recommend it always to people. It's just a very hard one, I think, to determine to sell to children, because it felt very mature and it felt very adult, but it also is a children's book, and it makes sense that it's a children's book, but it doesn't at the same time, and it's a very tricky one to sell. But I think in some respects that means that it's one that can be read and loved and enjoyed by everyone, not just children or not just adults. I think it's just one of those special books. So both of these books are quite big, and both of them span many a character's story arc and many kind of a decent amount of time in these books, where this book kind of succeeded in actually, indulging in everybody's story in a way that made sense to the world, in a way that kind of didn't detract from the overall plot, is where this kind of book failed, because it tried to stuff too much into the end with too many characters, and it just felt a little bit chaotic and a little bit nonsensical. It poses the question, how big should a children's book be? Because this book didn't really feel like a children's book. This book did. Also, when you're selling children's books, you're not really selling books to the children per se. You're selling it to the adults, because the adults are the ones who have the spending power, and the adults are the ones who ultimately make the choice. And selling books like these to adults is very difficult, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of parents, well, from my experience, a lot of parents do underestimate the child that they're buying books for. Or it's the grandparents or the friends of the parents who are buying books for a child they don't really know so well, and then they oftentimes will underestimate the child's reading ability. So selling books that are kind of big is very difficult, because a parent or an adult might assume that a child would prefer something that will keep their attention from the word go, will be quick and easy to read, which I think is fair. And you do find a lot of fiction in the sort of the 8 to 12 age range that is thinner and does make more sense to be thinner and are subsequently easier to sell. But then do children miss out on really great books like this one? Especially when you consider that in the Harry Potter series and in the His Dark Materials series, some really classical, popular children's stories, bar the first 3 books of Harry Potter, the books are quite big, and children aren't really afraid of that. Children do still read them and enjoy them. This is probably the same, this is a bit bigger than Prisoner of Azkaban. This is probably the same as, it's a bit smaller than Goblet of Fire, I think. But still, they're very intimidating to parents. So then how can you kind of reconcile putting in a really well-crafted book and plot into a kind of smaller amount of space just to fit a parent's vision of what a child would want to read? Because this book can probably get away with being bigger. This book could have been something like the His Dark Materials series, in the way that in His Dark Materials, in each book, you meet new characters and you get new story arcs which all converge on one point. And that's something that I feel like was the ambition of this author and could have achieved either over a series or within a bigger book. But then would that detract from it being a children's book? Especially when you see, in a lot of shops, His Dark Materials might be pitched within the teenage section, because it's easier to sell it out of there, even though you're following Lyra, who is a 12-year-old, so generally fits into that 8 to 12 fiction. And then you also get the Book of Dust, which is, again, put into the teenage section, which is so dark, and it's got really insidious themes to it, and quite some bad language at times, which it should be in the adult section, and I find it really difficult to sell it to parents for their child, because I'm like, I don't know if you really should. I don't want to say no, but I also want to advise that there are some issues here. And I think that's why it's really important to have school librarians who are the ones to best understand a child's reading needs and reading ability, and to put books like this in their hands so that that child can experience a big book and can experience what magic a big book can give to them, and experience a more longer and more engrossing storyline than you might get in just a quick small book. And I think it's the school librarians who are so important in this, because they're the ones that aren't having to sell to parents. They're the ones that are going directly to the child and respecting the child as their own reader. And I think we definitely, in the UK perhaps, underappreciate and undervalue school librarians, and they are doing a job that a bookseller might not be able to do, which makes it even more important. So yeah, that went in a way that I didn't expect it to go in, and here's to school librarians. If you are a school librarian, keep doing your job, because you're great. And yeah, I guess I'm just gonna end the video there and hope that it wasn't too long, and hope that I didn't rant on for too much. But yeah, for the time being, that's this video, and I'll see you next time for another one. Bye bye.